Julia always believed that life could bloom even in the most unexpected corners of the city. She inherited from her grandmother the small flower cart, with its paint faded by time, but carrying the memory of happy moments. Since she was a little girl, she used to accompany her grandmother on cold mornings, helping arrange the roses, lilies, and sunflowers, while listening to stories about the importance of each flower. When her grandmother passed away, Julia found herself alone, but determined to keep that legacy alive. Every day, early in the morning, she pushed the cart to a busy corner, where the hurried comings and goings contrasted with the calm of her gaze. There, among honking horns and hurried footsteps, she offered a bit of color and fragrance to those who needed it. Julia didn't have much, but she possessed something few others carried, a smile that seemed to light up the street. Her fingers, marked by constant work, cared for the flowers as if they were rare jewels, removing dry leaves and watering each petal with tenderness. Even when facing difficulties, she never lost hope. She lived off small acts of kindness and believed that, just like the flowers that bloom after winter, her life could still find a new path. The cart, simple as it was, became a symbol of resilience, and every flower sold felt like a promise of better days. On that corner, Julia didn't just sell flowers. She delivered stories, memories, and a bit of warmth in a city that, for many, seemed too cold. On the other side of the city, Alexander was a name that carried power and influence. Owner of an empire in the real estate sector, he accumulated achievements, numbers, and properties that rose like monuments of glass and concrete. His life was governed by contracts, meetings, and decisions that affected thousands of people, but for him, they were merely business strategies. Alexander's routine boiled down to unmissable commitments and ever more ambitious goals. His steps echoed through the immaculate hallways of the offices he commanded, while his imposing presence made it difficult for anyone to approach him easily. There was no space for distractions or what he considered emotional weaknesses. He kept his distance from anything that couldn't be planned or controlled. His childhood, marked by the absence of affection and constant pressure, turned him into a meticulous, reserved, and distrustful man. His armor was silence, and his gaze was always on the lookout for potential threats. Alexander learned early on that feelings were openings, and the business world didn't forgive those who let weaknesses show. Surrounded by luxury, sophisticated dinners, and constant travels, he felt that something was missing, but he would never admit this to himself. He preferred to believe he was born to lead, not to feel. Deep down, though, a silent unease began to grow, something even he couldn't name. An emptiness disguised by achievements and applause that, over time, no longer meant as much as they once did. On an ordinary morning, fate decided to cross two completely different worlds. Julia had just arranged her cart, lining up the flowers by color and scent, when a greater commotion started to draw the attention of pedestrians. Black cars with dark windows slowly approached, clearing the way on a street where luxury was rarely seen. Alexander stepped out of one of them, hurried, looking at the watch on his wrist, not quite paying attention to where he was walking. His firm steps ended up colliding with Julia's simple cart, which rocked slightly before a few flowers fell to the ground. The impact, though subtle, was enough to draw the attention of both. For a moment, Alexander fixed his gaze on the fallen flowers. He, who spent days ignoring the beauty around him, felt unsettled. He bent down to pick up some petals, a simple gesture, but almost unheard of for him. He pulled a large bill from his wallet, as if trying to solve a problem quickly, and extended it to Julia without looking directly at her. Julia, with a restrained smile, refused the money. She carefully picked up the flowers, gently cleaned the stem of one of them, and placed it back in the cart. She calmly said that some things couldn't be bought, that flowers carried meanings, and that life in them was not measured by values. Alexander did not insist. He put the bill back in his wallet, watching the young woman with a curious look. Something in that refusal unsettled him more than he would like to admit. He was used to solving everything with numbers, but in that brief encounter, he felt out of place, almost powerless. Without prolonging the interaction, he went on his way, but with the feeling that he had left something behind. Julia, in turn, returned to her routine, but deep down, she kept the strange impression left by the man with the distant gaze and restrained gesture. Little did they know, that moment would only be the beginning of a change that would transform both of their lives in a way neither could predict. In the days that followed the unexpected encounter, Alexander realized that something had shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. The image of Julia, simple, with her careful hands arranging the flowers, kept returning at random moments, as if the memory stubbornly refused to fade. He tried to push the thought away, immersed in the commitments and responsibilities that filled his hours, but there was an unease he couldn't explain. The meetings continued as usual. Reports, charts, and projections piled up in front of him. But for some reason, the numbers no longer brought the same excitement as before. The business victories that once represented milestones of achievement now seemed quieter. There was a new weariness in his gaze, not from the excess of work, but from the absence of something he couldn't name. Meanwhile, Julia continued her routine on the busy street. The cart remained steadfast on the same corner, like a splash of color amid the city's gray landscape. Even on days of low traffic, she kept her patience, tending to the flowers with care. The way she ran her fingers through the petals and watered each pot revealed the passion she felt for that work. On a cloudy afternoon, when the cold wind seemed to announce the arrival of rain, Alexander decided to change his usual route. He asked the driver to slow down when passing the street, where he remembered seeing the florist. The cart was still there, and so was she. With her serene gaze, Julia picked up a few fallen leaves and adjusted a freshly arranged bouquet. There was something about that scene that held Alexander's attention more than any conference or business event could. The next day, the weather forecast warned of a heavy storm. Still, Julia set up her cart as usual, bringing along an old umbrella that barely managed to protect all the flowers. Around noon, the clouds grew denser, and the inevitable rain fell without respite. Most vendors packed up their products and closed their doors, but Julia stayed, trying to protect the flowers with pieces of tarpaulin and some plastic bags she had improvised. Alexander, returning from a meeting, observed the scene from afar. The impulse was stronger than the logic that always guided his steps. He asked the driver to stop the car and got out, without an umbrella, walking toward the drenched cart. Without saying anything, he held the tarpaulin to better cover the space and helped Julia lift one of the pots that had almost fallen due to the force of the wind. The rainwater ran down his face, but he seemed not to care. Julia accepted the help in silence. Their hands touched for a brief moment as they adjusted one of the larger pots, and the contrast was evident. Alexander's hands, accustomed to contracts and luxury pens, found in hers a firmness born from constant work and care for a simple life. They didn't exchange words at that moment. They just worked together, in an effort that seemed natural, as if they had done this before. When the rain subsided, Alexander stepped back without making a fuss, returning to the drenched car, while Julia continued to tend to the flowers, as if nothing had happened, but something had changed. That night, Alexander couldn't concentrate on the reports waiting on his desk. The spreadsheets were open on his computer screen, but his mind wandered to the image of her hands holding the flowers while the rain fell relentlessly. For the first time in a long time, he realized that he was more interested in understanding that feeling than in hitting the company's next target. On the other side of the city, Julia gathered her things a little later than usual. Before leaving, she looked at the empty, silent street, thinking about the unexpected gesture of the man who, days ago, had knocked over her flowers without noticing. There was no rancor in her heart, only a growing curiosity about who he really was behind that expensive suit and the cold eyes that, for a brief moment, had shown something deeper. What started with a simple bump gradually became a silent and inexplicable connection. Alexander, unknowingly, began to include that detour in his route whenever he could, just to observe from a distance. Julia, even pretending not to notice, started to wait for those brief moments when she would see from afar that man with a serious expression who seemed to be trying to understand something that had always been simple to her, the beauty of the little things. Days passed, and Alexander no longer perceived time with the same clarity as before. What he had always controlled precisely, schedules, agendas, and plans, began to slip through the cracks of his routine. His quick visits to the corner where Julia kept her flower cart became a discreet habit. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, but his presence repeated itself like a silent gesture, something he couldn't explain. One morning, while absent-mindedly flipping through a newspaper during a business coffee, a small article caught his attention. It was about a charity event organized by a traditional foundation aimed at supporting small local merchants. One of the initiatives involved distributing flowers as a symbol of renewal and hope. Without thinking too much, Alexander signaled to his assistant to confirm his attendance. It wasn't something he would do under other circumstances, but that day, he felt he needed to be there. The event hall gathered influential people, business owners, politicians, and representatives of various institutions. Everything was happening with the formality typical of gatherings of that size. Amid the cold greetings and strategic smiles, each guest received a small flower upon entering. Alexander, used to calculated gestures, found the simplicity of the gift strange. The delicacy of that modest flower, a white camellia bud, brought him an unexpected memory. Julia, with her flower cart, suggesting that every choice had a meaning. He tucked the flower in the inner pocket of his suit, not knowing exactly why. During the event, his mind wandered, and once again, he found himself wondering what it would be like to live outside those walls, away from the formality of business. He observed the small merchants who went up on stage to thank for the support they had received, with simple but heartfelt speeches. There was a sincerity there that he hadn't encountered in a long time. Days later, Alexander decided to do something he rarely did: walk without a destination, away from the commitments that always filled his schedule. He passed by the street where he knew he would find Julia. This time, he got out of the car and approached the cart, without his usual hurry. She was arranging a bouquet of chrysanthemums, her hands moving with lightness and precision. Not knowing exactly what he was looking for, Alexander pointed to one of the pots. Julia picked a white lily and handed it to him with a calm gesture. She didn't mention the price, nor did he ask. He simply accepted the flower, holding it for a few moments before placing it in his pocket, in the same place where he had put the camellia at the event. The symbolism of that lily, a new beginning, seemed to echo inside him without needing full understanding. That night, he set aside the reports and acquisition proposals that waited on his desk. He remained seated, looking out the window while holding the lily between his fingers. The city, seen from above, seemed less grand than usual. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't feel the need to achieve something more. He just sat there in silence, feeling the presence of a feeling he still couldn't define. The visits to the flower cart became less occasional. Julia noticed the frequency without showing surprise. The encounters repeated themselves simply, without great events. He bought a flower, she handed it to him, and there was always a moment of silence between them that somehow seemed to say everything. One day, Alexander arrived before Julia had even finished organizing the flowers. He watched from a distance as she arranged the pots and hung small wooden tags where she wrote, with simple handwriting, the name of each species. Her attention to detail was something that impressed him. There was an almost artisanal care, a respect for the craft that seemed foreign to the hurried world he knew. He decided it was time to learn more about this woman who intrigued him so. He asked his assistant for information about Julia, but the data was scarce. A street florist, without formal business registration, without a social media account, without connections that could be easily traced. The mystery only grew. Days later, he watched as she helped an elderly lady choose a small bouquet of violets. Julia's kindness, the way she knelt to be at the customer's height and explained how to care for those fragile flowers, brought an unusual warmth to Alexander's chest. Accustomed to tough negotiations and inflexible contracts, he found himself questioning his own values. He began reflecting on the decisions he had made so far and what he truly desired for the future. The material achievements, though grand, no longer filled the void he felt so clearly now. On a clear afternoon, Alexander arrived at Julia's cart with a different purpose. He brought a small pot of ferns, bought from a store far from there. He wanted to give the florist something simple, as if he wished to return a kindness. He handed her the pot without saying anything, and waited for her reaction. Julia accepted the gift with a gentle smile, and for a moment, her eyes shone in a way that Alexander would never forget. The closeness between them grew without hurry. There were no declarations or promises, just small gestures that repeated themselves, building a silent trust. He began to see the city with new eyes, noticing the flowers that grew on the sidewalks, the details he had once ignored. Alexander gradually understood that true wealth was not in the buildings he had erected, or the profits he had accumulated, but in the simplicity of an unexpected encounter, and in the care for what seemed small, but, in reality, carried a transformative force. From then on, every flower he received from Julia was more than just a gift. It was a reminder that life could begin again at any moment, even for those who had forgotten what it truly meant to live. The bond that Alexander and Julia created in their simple encounters by the flower cart grew more intimate with each passing day. There was no urgency, no impatience typical of the business world Alexander had always conducted. On the contrary, everything flowed at a calm pace, like the seasons that follow one another without haste, allowing life to find its natural course. The mornings became a moment both of them looked forward to, even though they hadn't arranged anything. Alexander appeared frequently, almost always without warning, but never without purpose. Little by little, he swapped his impeccable suits for simpler clothes, as if unconsciously wishing to belong to the scene that Julia inhabited so naturally. The leather shoes were set aside some days, replaced by discreet sneakers that better endured the worn sidewalks of the city. There was something new for Alexander in that space. By her side, he began to notice the small rituals that gave meaning to her days. Julia arrived early, long before the bustle of the streets gained momentum, and patiently arranged each flower in its proper place. At the end of each afternoon, before packing up the cart, she watered the plants and made notes in a notebook about the flowers that had attracted the most attention from the customers. It wasn't just a business. It was a legacy she carried with respect and gratitude. Alexander watched everything without hurry, noticing details that would have gone unnoticed before. The way Julia smiled when she saw a child receive a flower as a gift, or how she, without fanfare, placed small wild flowers in the less conspicuous pots to give them color and life. He began to feel a quiet desire to be part of that simplicity. One evening, as he approached the cart, Alexander noticed that Julia wasn't alone. A boy, no older than 8, was helping clean the dry leaves and picking up small petals that had fallen on the ground. He was the son of a neighbor, who came whenever he could to give the florist a hand. Alexander watched their interaction, the affectionate way Julia explained to the boy how to care for the more delicate plants. The scene brought an unexpected feeling of longing to him, not for something he had lost, but for something he may have never had. At another moment, Alexander saw her close the cart earlier than usual. Curious, he followed from a distance as she walked to a nearby square, carrying a small pot of violets. She sat on a discreet bench and stayed there for a few minutes in silence, holding the flowers in her lap. Then she got up and placed the pot at the base of a tree. Alexander would later understand that the tree had been planted in honor of Julia's grandmother, and that she made this visit a ritual of remembrance and affection. Without realizing it, Alexander began to act differently. In his business ventures, he reviewed contracts that seemed unfair, postponed collection deadlines for small shop owners, and in board meetings, surprised his partners by rejecting proposals that would harm residents of neighborhoods where they intended to build new buildings. Something inside him had changed in a subtle but permanent way. The trust that Julia placed in Alexander grew slowly over time. She accepted an invitation to visit one of the squares revitalized by his company, where community gardens now bloomed. There, Julia collected seeds to plant in her cart. Alexander's gesture of opening that space to the community did not go unnoticed. She realized that there was a man trying to find a new meaning for his own story. As the days passed, Alexander began to help her with small details of her routine. He would collect the heavier pots at the end of the day, carry the fresh flower boxes she received in the morning, and at times, would simply stand beside her in silence, just appreciating the quiet that her work provided. He no longer felt like a stranger in that simple world. He felt like a part of it. Winter arrived with its cold wind, and the city lost some of its colors. But Julia's cart remained a point of light amid the gray streets. She adapted to the season, offering flowers resistant to the cold in small arrangements with pine cones and dry branches, which still conveyed beauty. Alexander realized that, by her side, he had learned to appreciate even what once seemed valueless to him. It was during this time that Alexander began to open up a little more about his life. Little by little, he told Julia about the lonely childhood he had, about his strict father, and the effort he made to become someone respected in the business world. There was no drama in his words, just the sincerity of someone who wanted to be understood. Julia listened without interrupting, offering only her presence, which, to him, was more than enough. The differences between their worlds did not prevent them from creating a discreet and comfortable routine. On certain Saturdays, Alexander would show up with hot coffee, bought from the same simple kiosk she frequented. On other occasions, he brought books about plants, found in second-hand bookstores he had never visited before, and Julia, in turn, would surprise him with small bouquets made especially for him, with flowers chosen based on what he seemed to feel that day. Without realizing it, their friendship evolved into something deeper. There were no declarations, but Julia's gaze softened Alexander's days, and his presence brought her a kind of silent security. It was as if they had both found true company, without demands or expectations. One Sunday afternoon, Julia invited Alexander to help her replant some seedlings in old pots that had belonged to her grandmother. The gesture meant more than just an activity. It was as if she were allowing him to be part of her history, of her most precious memory. Alexander accepted the invitation with respect and remained attentive to every explanation she gave about the care needed for those delicate plants. As they placed fresh soil into the pots, their hands touched in an unintentional way, but the warmth of that contact remained in their memories for hours. Time passed. What began as a careful and respectful approach was now a connection that deepened serenely. Alexander found himself becoming more and more distant from the world he had once dominated before meeting Julia. There was no rush to change what they felt, only the certainty that something real had blossomed between them. And so, what was once a simple friendship began to carry the weight and lightness of a feeling that transformed, with the same care Julia dedicated to each plant in her cart. Alexander, who had once believed life was about achievements and numbers, now understood the value of something that could not be measured, the constant presence of someone who taught him to see the world with new eyes. Winter slowly bid farewell, and with it, the cold mornings gave way to milder days, where flowers began to display vibrant colors again. Julia kept to her routine, reorganizing the cart with new seedlings that had been carefully cultivated over the past months. The activity in the city center increased, and gradually, her customers returned as well. There was a quiet hope in the air, as if a new beginning was within reach. Alexander remained nearby, but without invading the space that Julia so valued. Their mutual understanding had become something natural, a silent agreement that filled the time without the need for words. However, behind his apparent serenity, Alexander carried a weight he had not yet found the courage to reveal. The gears of the real estate market were turning relentlessly, and one of the most ambitious projects of his company was approaching the decisive phase. It was a development that promised to transform an important area of the city, bringing prestige and high profits. The land chosen for construction was part of an old negotiation, made long before Alexander met Julia. He had postponed the final signature, delaying it as much as possible, but the pressure from partners and investors became unbearable. The documents were ready, contracts revised, and the city's approval had already been secured. The construction site would be set up in the coming weeks. Alexander knew exactly where the demolition would begin, and with a tightness in his chest, he realized that the old building, under which Julia sold her flowers, would be one of the first to disappear. For days, Alexander tried to find a solution that could reconcile his business commitments with the preservation of the space where Julia worked. However, the clauses he had signed were inflexible. Halting the project meant giving up millions, and more than that, destroying strategic alliances that had taken years to build. He never imagined that something in his professional life could collide so directly with what, now, gave meaning to his days. The inevitable drew closer, and he could not prevent it. On a gray afternoon, walking through the streets near Julia's cart, Alexander saw construction workers posting notices on the poles and walls. They were official communications, informing about the start of the works and requesting the clearing of the area. Julia's cart, always in the same place, seemed small and vulnerable in the face of that cold and impersonal movement. The next day, Julia found the papers pasted on the pole she used to lean against to rest. Her eyes scanned the words with difficulty. She read and reread the notice, looking for a loophole that did not exist. The building would be demolished. The street where she sold flowers would lose its view, the shelter of the awning, the flow of customers who already knew her spot. Everything would be erased, as if it had never existed. At first, she thought it was an impersonal decision, part of the processes of the city that moved forward without looking back. But when she stopped to read the signature on the documents, she recognized the name of Alexander's company. A heavy silence fell over her, as if something had been ripped from within her without warning. The man she had allowed into her life, who had become part of her routine and her trust, was the same one responsible for the imminent disappearance of her small world. Alexander knew, that same night, that Julia had discovered. He found her collecting the flowers earlier than usual, her movements more rigid, less gentle. There was a distance in her posture, something he couldn't reach. No matter how much he wanted to explain, the words didn't seem enough. The decisions had already been made long before, but that did not lessen the gravity of what was about to happen. In the following days, Julia withdrew. She didn't stop working, but she restricted her actions to only what was necessary. She received customers politely, delivered the flowers with the same care as always, but avoided prolonging any interaction. And Alexander, respecting the space she seemed to demand, limited himself to watching her from afar. The routine that had once been shared in comfortable silence was now becoming a strange territory. Alexander began to wonder where he had lost himself along the way. He knew that his absence in the business world would not be forgiven by the partners if he tried to back out. But he also understood that the price of that loyalty cost the only genuine connection he had found in years. In a gesture of silent desperation, Alexander decided to do something he had never considered before. Without Julia knowing, he bought all the flowers from her cart on a rainy morning. He paid in cash, without mentioning his name, sending a trusted employee to handle the transaction. And, with the car's trunk full of arrangements and bouquets, Alexander drove around the city. He stopped at squares, hospitals, and nursing homes, giving the flowers to people who didn't even know him. The gestures of surprise and gratitude he received did not lessen the weight in his chest, but they showed him a different path from the one he had always followed. The next day, Julia learned what he had done. The news spread quickly among the neighborhood's residents, and she found out that someone had distributed her flowers all over the city. The gesture was silent, without expectation of return, but deep enough to make her rethink. In the week that followed, Julia continued going to her usual spot, even though she knew her days there were numbered. And Alexander, in a more emotional than rational impulse, showed up on her grandmother's birthday, bringing a small pot with the woman's favorite flowers, the one who had inspired Julia so much. There were no words between them, but in that gesture, she saw a man who, somehow, was trying to make amends for what he could. The demolition was certain. The future of the development, inevitable, but something had changed permanently. Julia understood that Alexander, behind the impersonal decisions and rigid contracts, was trying to find a way to reconnect with what truly mattered. The distance still existed, but now it carried a silent truce. They hadn't resolved everything, but they recognized that the feeling that had grown between them could not be ignored. It was a fragile beginning of reconciliation, built not on promises, but on small gestures of humanity. The weeks that followed the separation were filled with silence and reflection. Julia remained strong, even when everything around her seemed to collapse. The spot where she sold her flowers was no longer the same. The neighborhood slowly emptied, and each new notice of restriction reinforced the certainty that the space would soon cease to exist. Still, she stayed, selling her last flowers with the same dedication she had learned from her grandmother, not out of hope for change, but out of respect for the history she had built in that place. Alexander, for his part, limited himself to observing from a distance, not out of disinterest, but because he understood that Julia needed time. He watched her continue her routine with the same determination, although her face carried a contained sadness. Lately, he had learned to recognize in the small gestures what Julia didn't say aloud, the way she arranged the lavender sprigs on her cart, or how she took longer than usual to water the daisies. They were signs of an attachment that went beyond simple habit. They were fragments of a silent love for everything that space represented. One morning, the cold gave way to a milder climate. The sun timidly peeked through the clouds, warming the sidewalks slightly, still wet from the previous night's rain. Julia was arranging her flowers as usual, but this time, she noticed something different. A small envelope, delicately resting on the wooden bench where she usually took her breaks. When she opened it, she found a simple note, accompanied by a single flower, a white lily. The flower was fresh, newly picked, and its delicate scent filled the air around her. The gesture, simple and unpretentious, brought an unexpected warmth to Julia's chest. She knew who had left it there. No signature was needed. and in some way that simplicity stirred something she had been trying to contain. The memory of Alexander's small acts returned, not the ones related to his business, but the moments when he showed a side of himself that no one else knew. The man who spent hours beside her, simply watching the flowers, who walked in silence at the end of the day, and who distributed his flowers to hospitals and parks without ever seeking recognition. In the following days, other small gestures were repeated: a pot with sunflower seeds left discreetly, a thermos with hot coffee on colder mornings, and even a small book of old poems that Julia's grandmother used to love reading. There were no direct encounters, just signs of a presence that, little by little, was occupying space in her heart again. It was as though Alexander was rebuilding a bridge, not with grand acts, but with details that showed care and respect. One evening, Julia walked to the garden of the small house where she lived. There was an old flower bed she had maintained since childhood, which her grandmother had always helped care for. When she arrived, she noticed that someone had planted new shoots next to the flowers that had already grown. They were violets, her grandmother's favorites, and they were there as a silent gift. She knelt down, touched the petals gently, and understood that Alexander, without saying a word, was trying to care for what was most important to her. From that moment on, something inside Julia changed. She didn't give in to resentment, even knowing that the simple life she loved was about to change. She decided that, although the future was uncertain, she would not let the pain of loss erase the beauty of what still bloomed around her. And Alexander was part of that, not anymore as the distant and unreachable man from the beginning, but as someone who, little by little, was shedding his defenses, revealing a sensitivity she had never imagined finding. Alexander was also going through a silent transformation. His world, once driven solely by numbers and goals, was now gaining new colors. He realized that the value of things was not in the figures that had always surrounded him, but in the simple experiences and the connections he was beginning to build. Julia's company, even from a distance, showed him a different meaning for his choices. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking of victories or accomplishments. He was thinking only about being present, even if in silence. Time passed slowly during that period. The discreet visits continued, and little by little, Julia began to accept Alexander's presence again. One day, she found him leaning against the old building that would be demolished, watching the sky tinted by the last rays of sunlight. Without saying anything, she stayed by his side for a few minutes. There was no need for words. They both understood that this moment was a new beginning. On the anniversary of her grandmother's passing, Julia went to the old garden, now flowerless. When she arrived, she found a new flower bed, carefully cultivated, with flowers her grandmother loved. Alexander had arranged everything without her knowing, and in that moment, Julia understood that the man in front of her had truly changed. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, but rather showing, with silent actions, that he cared. A few days later, Julia ended her sales at the cart and walked to a small park, a place she used to visit as a child. Alexander was there, sitting on a bench, looking at the fountain in the center of the square. She sat next to him, and together, they stayed in silence, simply observing the water falling gently. There was no need for anything else. The feeling that was growing between them didn't require explanation. It was a love that had grown slowly, without hurry, like the flowers she had so lovingly cultivated. That night, Alexander invited Julia to see a new project he had designed. It wasn't a skyscraper or a business center, but rather a community space, with gardens and areas designated for small businesses, like hers. He wanted to create a place where stories like Julia's could bloom again. And, in that gesture, he gave her not just a project, but the hope for a shared future. The love between them wasn't marked by grand declarations or exaggerated promises. It grew in the details, in mutual understanding, and in the respect for each other's space and essence. Alexander had learned to listen to Julia's silence, and she, in turn, discovered that behind the businessman was a heart that, little by little, was allowing itself to love. The awakening of this love happened like the arrival of spring after a harsh winter. It wasn't abrupt, but natural, as if both of them knew that this was the path they needed to follow. And when they finally held hands, they did so with the certainty that they were ready for a new beginning. The late afternoon brought with it a sky tinged with soft shades of orange and gold, As the city began to calm down after another busy day, Alexander waited in front of the old garden that now bloomed again. Thanks to the discreet care he had given it, he wore something simple, without the formality of the suits he usually wore. There was an air of serenity in his posture, like someone who finally understood what truly mattered. Julia arrived with quiet steps, carrying a small bouquet of violets, the same flowers that now colored that special space for her. Their eyes met in silence, and for a moment, nothing around them seemed to matter. He invited her to walk, guiding her to a small, unpretentious restaurant where everything was warm and simple, just the way she liked it. During dinner, Alexander remained present, attentive to her small gestures, the way she smiled when tasting a dessert, or how she gazed at the lights reflected in the window. He felt that this moment carried a deep meaning, more than any other moment in his life. When they left the restaurant, the night had already advanced, and the city seemed to slowly fall asleep. It was then that, without hurry, he led her to a small lookout, from where they could see the lights spreading through the streets below. There, Alexander spoke of his transformation. He told her how she had changed his view of the world, awakening something in him that had been dormant for a long time. He didn't use rehearsed words or grand promises. He simply expressed, in a simple and sincere way, that she had become someone essential in his life, someone who, without asking for anything in return, had taught him the value of true things. Julia listened to every word with an open heart, and in that moment, both of them understood that what they felt could no longer be ignored. He invited her to walk by his side from then on, not as a businessman offering something in return, but as a man willing to share a new path, and she accepted, surrendering herself to that new story that was unfolding, under the soft light of that calm night. The night spread like a peaceful cloak over the city, while the streetlights gently illuminated the sidewalks. Julia and Alexander walked side by side, without hurry, as if each step was a new beginning. The slight chill made her draw a little closer, and he, attentive, extended his arm to protect her, with a simple gesture, but full of meaning. There was no need for words in that moment. The exchanged glances revealed everything they felt. The reflection of the colored lights in the shop windows cast silhouettes around them, and the distant sound of the city created a serene backdrop. They walked together until the street ended, and the view of the city opened up, as if that was the exact point where the past was left behind. The future seemed promising, and there, under the subtle glow of the lights, their story continued its course. A new journey had begun. For more emotional stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications.